Chapter 15. The Pilot's Monopoly. One day on board the Alex Scott, my chief, Mr. Bixby, was crawling carefully through a close place at Cat Island, both leads going and everybody holding his breath. The captain, a nervous, apprehensive man, kept still as long as he could, but finally broke down and shouted from the hurricane deck. "For gracious sake, give her steam, Mr. Bixby. Give her steam, she'll never raise the reef on this headway." For all the effect that was produced upon Mr. Bixby, one would have supposed that no remark had been made, but 5 minutes later, when the danger was past and the leads laid in, he burst instantly into a consuming fury, and gave the captain the most admirable cursing I ever listened to. No bloodshed ensued, but that was because the captain's cause was weak, for ordinarily he was not a man to take correction quietly. Having now set forth in detail the nature of the science of piloting, and likewise described the rank which the pilot held among the fraternity of steamboatmen, this seems a fitting place to say a few words about an organization which the pilots once formed for the protection of their guild. It was curious and noteworthy in this, that it was perhaps the compactest, the completest, and the strongest commercial organization ever formed among men. For a long time wages had been $250 a month, but curiously enough, as steamboats multiplied and business increased, the wages began to fall little by little. It was easy to discover the reason of this. Too many pilots were being made. It was nice to have a cub, a steersman, to do all the hard work for a couple of years gratis, while his master sat on a high bench and smoked. All pilots and captains had sons or nephews who wanted to be pilots. By and by it came to pass that nearly every pilot on the river had a steersman. When a steersman had made an amount of progress that was satisfactory to any two pilots in the trade, they could get a pilot's license for him by signing an application directed to the United States inspector. Nothing further was needed, usually no questions were asked, no proofs of capacity required. Very well, this growing swarm of new pilots presently began to undermine the wages in order to get berths. Too late, apparently, the knights of the tiller perceived their mistake. Plainly something had to be done and quickly, but what was to be the needful thing? A close organization. Nothing else would answer. To compass this seemed an impossibility, so it was talked and then dropped. It was too likely to ruin whoever ventured to move in the matter, but at last about a dozen of the boldest, and some of them the best, pilots on the river launched themselves into the enterprise and took all the chances. They got a special charter from the legislature, with large powers under the name of the Pilots' Benevolent Association, elected their officers, completed their organization, contributed capital, put association wages up to $250 at once, and then retired to their homes, for they were promptly discharged from employment. But there were 2 or 3 unnoticed trifles in their bylaws which had the seeds of propagation in them. For instance, all idle members of the association in good standing were entitled to a pension of $25 per month. This began to bring in one straggler after another from the ranks of the new-fledged pilots in the dull summer season. Better have $25 than starve. The initiation fee was only $12, and no dues required from the unemployed. Also, the widows of deceased members in good standing could draw $25 per month, and a certain sum for each of their children. Also, the said deceased would be buried at the association's expense. These things resurrected all the superannuated and forgotten pilots in the Mississippi Valley. They came from farms, they came from interior villages, they came from everywhere. They came on crutches, on drays, in ambulances, anyway, so they got there. They paid in their $12 and straightway began to draw out $25 a month and calculate their burial bills. By and by, all the useless, helpless pilots and a dozen first-class ones were in the association, and 9/10 of the best pilots out of it and laughing at it. It was the laughingstock of the whole river. Everybody joked about the bylaw requiring members to pay 10% of their wages every month into the treasury for the support of the association, whereas all the members were outcast and tabooed, and no one would employ them. Everybody was derisively grateful to the association for taking all the worthless pilots out of the way, and leaving the whole field to the excellent and the deserving, and everybody was not only jocularly grateful for that, but for a result which naturally followed, namely, the gradual advance of wages as the busy season approached. Wages had gone up from the low figure of $100 a month to $125, and in some cases to $150. And it was great fun to enlarge upon the fact that this charming thing had been accomplished by a body of men not one of whom received a particle of benefit from it. Some of the jokers used to call at the association rooms and have a good time chaffing the members and offering them the charity of taking them as steersmen for a trip, so that they could see what the forgotten river looked like. However, the association was content, or at least it gave no sign to the contrary. Now and then it captured a pilot who was out of luck, and added him to its list, and these later additions were very valuable, for they were good pilots. The incompetent ones had all been absorbed before. As business freshened, wages climbed gradually up to $250, the association figure, and became firmly fixed there, and still without benefiting a member of that body, for no member was hired. The hilarity at the association's expense burst all bounds now. There was no end to the fun which that poor martyr had to put up with. However, it is a long lane that has no turning. Winter approached, business doubled and trebled, and an avalanche of Missouri, Illinois, and upper Mississippi River boats came pouring down to take a chance in the New Orleans trade. All of a sudden pilots were in great demand, and were correspondingly scarce. The time for revenge was come. It was a bitter pill to have to accept association pilots at last, yet captains and owners agreed that there was no other way. But none of these outcasts offered, so there was a still bitterer pill to be swallowed. They must be sought out and asked for their services. Captain was the first man who found it necessary to take the dose, and he had been the loudest derider of the organization. He hunted up one of the best of the association pilots and said, "Well, you boys have rather got the best of us for a little while, so I'll give in with as good a grace as I can. I've come to hire you. Get your trunk aboard right away. I want to leave at 12 o'clock. I don't know about that. Who is your other pilot? I've got is. Why? I can't go with him. He don't belong to the association. What? It's so. Do you mean to tell me that you won't turn a wheel with one of the very best and oldest pilots on the river, because he don't belong to your association? Yes, I do. Well, if this isn't putting on airs, I supposed I was doing you a benevolence, but I begin to think that I am the party that wants a favor done. Are you acting under a law of the concern? Yes. Show it to me. So they stepped into the association rooms, and the secretary soon satisfied the captain, who said, "Well, what am I to do? I have hired Mr. S. for the entire season." "I will provide for you," said the secretary. "I will detail a pilot to go with you, and he shall be on board at 12 o'clock. But if I discharge S., he will come on me for the whole season's wages." "Of course that is a matter between you and Mr. S., Captain. We cannot meddle in your private affairs." The captain stormed, but to no purpose. In the end he had to discharge S., pay him about $1,000, and take an association pilot in his place. The laugh was beginning to turn the other way now. Every day thenceforward a new victim fell. Every day some outraged captain discharged a non-association pet with tears and profanity, and installed a hated association man in his berth. In a very little while, idle non-associationists began to be pretty plenty, brisk as business was, and much as their services were desired. The laugh was shifting to the other side of their mouths most palpably. These victims, together with the captains and owners, presently ceased to laugh altogether, and began to rage about the revenge they would take when the passing business spurt was over. Soon all the laughers that were left were the owners and crews of boats that had 2 non-association pilots, but their triumph was not very long-lived. For this reason, it was a rigid rule of the association that its members should never, under any circumstances whatever, give information about the channel to any outsider. By this time about half the boats had none but association pilots, and the other half had none but outsiders. At the first glance one would suppose that when it came to forbidding information about the river these two parties could play equally at that game, but this was not so. At every good-sized town from one end of the river to the other, there was a wharf boat to land at instead of a wharf or a pier. Freight was stored in it for transportation. Waiting passengers slept in its cabins. Upon each of these wharf boats, the association's officers placed a strong box fastened with a peculiar lock which was used in no other service but one, the United States Mail Service. It was the letter-bag lock, a sacred governmental thing. By dint of much beseeching, the government had been persuaded to allow the association to use this lock. Every association man carried a key which would open these boxes. That key, or rather a peculiar way of holding it in the hand, when its owner was asked for river information by a stranger, for the success of the St. Louis and New Orleans Association had now bred tolerably thriving branches in a dozen neighboring steamboat trades, was the association man's sign and diploma of membership. and if the stranger did not respond by producing a similar key and holding it in a certain manner duly prescribed, his question was politely ignored. 84K. From the association's secretary, each member received a package of more or less gorgeous blanks, printed like a billhead on handsome paper, properly ruled in columns. A billhead worded something like this. These blanks were filled up day by day as the voyage progressed, and deposited in the several wharf-boat boxes. For instance, as soon as the first crossing out from St. Louis was completed, the items would be entered upon the blank under the appropriate headings, thus: St. Louis 9.5 feet, stern on courthouse, head on dead cottonwood above woodyard until you raise the first reef, then pull up square. Then under head of remarks, go just outside the wrecks, this is important. New snag just where you straighten down, go above it. The pilot who deposited that blank in the Cairo box, after adding to it the details of every crossing all the way down from St. Louis, took out and read half a dozen fresh reports from upward-bound steamers concerning the river between Cairo and Memphis, posted himself thoroughly, returned them to the box, and went back aboard his boat again, so armed against accident that he could not possibly get his boat into trouble without bringing the most ingenious carelessness to his aid. Imagine the benefits of so admirable a system in a piece of river 12 or 1300 miles long, whose channel was shifting every day. The pilot, who had formerly been obliged to put up with seeing a shoal place once or possibly twice a month, had 100 sharp eyes to watch it for him now, and bushels of intelligent brains to tell him how to run it. His information about it was seldom 24 hours old. If the reports in the last box chanced to leave any misgivings on his mind concerning a treacherous crossing, he had his remedy. He blew his steam whistle in a peculiar way as soon as he saw a boat approaching. The signal was answered in a peculiar way if that boat's pilots were association men, and then the two steamers ranged alongside, and all uncertainties were swept away by fresh information furnished to the inquirer by word of mouth, and in minute detached. 78K. The first thing a pilot did when he reached New Orleans or St. Louis was to take his final and elaborate report to the association parlors and hang it up there, after which he was free to visit his family. In these parlors a crowd was always gathered together, discussing changes in the channel, and the moment there was a fresh arrival, everybody stopped talking till this witness had told the newest news and settled the latest uncertainty. Other craftsmen can sink the shop, sometimes, and interest themselves in other matters. Not so with a pilot. He must devote himself wholly to his profession and talk of nothing else, for it would be small gain to be perfect one day and imperfect the next. He has no time or words to waste if he would keep posted. But the outsiders had a hard time of it. No particular place to meet and exchange information, no wharf-boat reports, none but chance and unsatisfactory ways of getting news. The consequence was that a man sometimes had to run 500 miles of river on information that was a week or 10 days old, at a fair stage of the river that might have answered, but when the dead low water came it was destructive. Now came another perfectly logical result. The outsiders began to ground steamboats, sink them, and get into all sorts of trouble, whereas accidents seemed to keep entirely away from the association men, wherefore even the owners and captains of boats furnished exclusively with outsiders, and previously considered to be wholly independent of the association and free to comfort themselves with brag and laughter, began to feel pretty uncomfortable. Still, they made a show of keeping up the brag, until one black day when every captain of the lot was formally ordered to immediately discharge his outsiders and take association pilots in their stead. And who was it that had the dashing presumption to do that? Alas, it came from a power behind the throne that was greater than the throne itself. It was the underwriters. It was no time to swap knives. Every outsider had to take his trunk ashore at once. Of course it was supposed that there was collusion between the association and the underwriters, but this was not so. The latter had come to comprehend the excellence of the report system of the association and the safety it secured, and so they had made their decision among themselves and upon plain business principles. There was weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth in the camp of the outsiders now, but no matter, there was but one course for them to pursue, and they pursued it. They came forward in couples and groups, and proffered their $12 and asked for membership. They were surprised to learn that several new bylaws had been long ago added. For instance, the initiation fee had been raised to $50. That sum must be tendered, and also 10%, of the wages which the applicant had received each and every month since the founding of the association. In many cases, this amounted to $300 or $400. Still, the association would not entertain the application until the money was present. Even then, a single adverse vote killed the application. Every member had to vote yes or no in person and before witnesses, so it took weeks to decide a candidacy, because many pilots were so long absent on voyages. However, the repentant sinners scraped their savings together, and one, by our tedious voting process, they were added to the fold. A time came at last when only about 10 remained outside. They said they would starve before they would apply. They remained idle a long while, because of course nobody could venture to employ Thejbk, 118k. By the association published the fact that upon a certain date, the wages would be raised to $500 per month. All the branch associations had grown strong now, and the Red River one had advanced wages to $700 a month. Reluctantly, the 10 outsiders yielded, in view of these things, and made application. There was another new bylaw, by this time, which required them to pay dues not only on all the wages they had received since the association was born, but also on what they would have received if they had continued at work up to the time of their application, instead of going off to pout in idleness. It turned out to be a difficult matter to elect them, but it was accomplished at last. The most virulent sinner of this batch had stayed out and allowed dues to accumulate against him so long that he had to send in $625 with his application. The association had a good bank account now and was very strong. There was no longer an outsider. A bylaw was added forbidding the reception of any more cubs or apprentices for 5 years, after which time a limited number would be taken, not by individuals, but by the association, upon these terms. The applicant must not be less than 18 years old, and of respectable family and good character. He must pass an examination as to education, pay $1,000 in advance for the privilege of becoming an apprentice, and must remain under the commands of the association until a great part of the membership, more than half, I think, should be willing to sign his application for a pilot's license. All previously articled apprentices were now taken away from their masters and adopted by the association. The president and secretary detailed them for service on one boat or another, as they chose, and changed them from boat to boat according to certain rules. If a pilot could show that he was in infirm health and needed assistance, one of the cubs would be ordered to go with him. The widow and orphan list grew, but so did the association's financial resources. The association attended its own funerals in state and paid for them. When occasion demanded, it sent members down the river upon searches for the bodies of brethren lost by steamboat accidents. A search of this kind sometimes cost $1,000. The association procured a charter and went into the insurance business also. It not only insured the lives of its members, but took risks on steamboats. The organization seemed indestructible. It was the tightest monopoly in the world. By the United States law, no man could become a pilot unless 2 duly licensed pilots signed his application, and now there was nobody outside of the association competent to sign. Consequently, the making of pilots was at an end. Every year some would die and others become incapacitated by age and infirmity. There would be no new ones to take their places. In time, the association could put wages up to any figure it chose, and as long as it should be wise enough not to carry the thing too far and provoke the national government into amending the licensing system, steamboat owners would have to submit, since there would be no help for it. The owners and captains were the only obstruction that lay between the association and absolute power, and at last this one was removed. Incredible as it may seem, the owners and captains deliberately did it themselves. When the Pilots' Association announced, months beforehand, that on the first day of September 1861, wages would be advanced to $500 per month, the owners and captains instantly put freights up a few cents, and explained to the farmers along the river the necessity of it, by calling their attention to the burdensome rate of wages about to be established. It was a rather slender argument, but the farmers did not seem to detect it. It looked reasonable to them that to add 5 cents freight on a bushel of corn was justifiable under the circumstances, overlooking the fact that this advance on a cargo of 40,000 sacks was a good deal more than necessary to cover the new wages. So straightway the captains and owners got up an association of their own, and proposed to put captains' wages up to $500 too, and move for another advance in freights. It was a novel idea, but of course an effect which had been produced once could be produced again. The new association decreed, for this was before all the outsiders had been taken into the Pilots' Association, that if any captain employed a non-association pilot, he should be forced to discharge him, and also pay a fine of $500. Several of these heavy fines were paid before the captain's organization grew strong enough to exercise full authority over its membership, but that all ceased presently. The captains tried to get the pilots to decree that no member of their corporation should serve under a non-association captain, but this proposition was declined. The pilots saw that they would be backed up by the captains and the underwriters anyhow, and so they wisely refrained from entering into entangling alliances. As I have remarked, the Pilots' Association was now the compactest monopoly in the world perhaps, and seemed simply indestructible. And yet the days of its glory were numbered. First, the new railroad stretching up through Mississippi, Tennessee, and Kentucky to northern railway centers began to divert the passenger travel from the steamers. Next the war came and almost entirely annihilated the steamboating industry during several years, leaving most of the pilots idle, and the cost of living advancing all the time. Then the treasurer of the St. Louis Association put his hand into the till and walked off with every dollar of the ample fund, and finally, the railroads intruding everywhere, there was little for steamers to do when the war was over but carry freights. So straightway some genius from the Atlantic coast introduced the plan of towing a dozen steamer cargoes down to New Orleans at the tail of a vulgar little tugboat. And behold, in the twinkling of an eye, as it were, the association and the noble science of piloting were things of the dead and pathetic past. Chapter 16. Racing Days. It was always the custom for the boats to leave New Orleans between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. From 3 o'clock onward they would be burning rosin and pitch pine, the sign of preparation, and so one had the picturesque spectacle of a rank, some 2 or 3 miles long, of tall, ascending columns of coal-black smoke, a colonnade which supported a sable roof of the same smoke blended together and spreading abroad over the city. Every outward-bound boat had its flag flying at the jack-staff, and sometimes a duplicate on the verge staff astern. 2 or 3 miles of mates were commanding and swearing with more than usual emphasis. Countless processions of freight barrels and boxes were spinning athwart the levee and flying aboard the stage planks. Belated passengers were dodging and skipping among these frantic things, hoping to reach the forecastle companionway alive, but having their doubts about it. Women with reticules and bandboxes were trying to keep up with husbands freighted with carpet sacks and crying babies, and making a failure of it by losing their heads in the whirl and roar and general distraction. Drays and baggage vans were clattering hither and thither in a wild hurry, every now and then getting blocked and jammed together, and then during 10 seconds one could not see them for the profanity, except vaguely and dimly. Every windlass connected with every forehatch, from one end of that long array of steamboats to the other, was keeping up a deafening whiz and whir, lowering freight into the hold, and the half-naked crews of perspiring Negroes that worked them were roaring such songs as De La's Sack, De La's Sack, inspired to unimaginable exaltation by the chaos of turmoil and racket that was driving everybody else mad. 158k. By this time, the hurricane and boiler decks of the steamers would be packed, and black with passengers. The last bells would begin to clang all down the line, and then the powwow seemed to double. In a moment or two the final warning came, a simultaneous din of Chinese gongs with the cry, "All dat ain't goin', please to get a show." And behold, the powwow quadrupled. People came swarming ashore, overturning excited stragglers that were trying to swarm aboard. One more moment later a long array of stage planks was being hauled in, each with its customary latest passenger clinging to the end of it with teeth, nails, and everything else, and the customary latest procrastinator making a wild spring shoreward over his heejbk. 164k. Now a number of the boats slide backward into the stream, leaving wide gaps in the serried rank of steamers. Citizens crowd the decks of boats that are not to go, in order to see the sight. Steamer after steamer straightens herself up, gathers all her strength, and presently comes swinging by under a tremendous head of steam, with flag flying, black smoke rolling, and her entire crew of firemen and deckhands, usually swarthy Negroes, massed together on the forecastle, the best voice in the lot towering from the midst being mounted on the capstan, waving his hat or a flag, and all roaring a mighty chorus, while the parting cannons boom and the multitudinous spectators swing their hats and huzzah. Steamer after steamer falls into line, and the stately procession goes winging its flight up the river. In the old times, whenever 2 fast boats started out on a race, with a big crowd of people looking on, it was inspiring to hear the crews sing, especially if the time were nightfall, and the forecastle lit up with the red glare of the torch baskets. Racing was royal fun. The public always had an idea that racing was dangerous, whereas the opposite was the case. That is, after the laws were passed which restricted each boat to just so many pounds of steam to the square inch, no engineer was ever sleepy or careless when his heart was in a race. He was constantly on the alert, trying gauge-cocks and watching things. The dangerous place was on slow, plodding boats, where the engineers drowsed around and allowed chips to get into the doctor and shut off the water supply from the boilers. In the flush times of steamboating, a race between two notoriously fleet steamers was an event of vast importance. The date was set for it several weeks in advance, and from that time forward, the whole Mississippi Valley was in a state of consuming excitement. Politics and the weather were dropped, and people talked only of the coming race. As the time approached, the two steamers stripped and got ready. Every encumbrance that added weight or exposed a resisting surface to wind or water was removed if the boat could possibly do without it. The spars, and sometimes even their supporting derricks, were sent ashore, and no means left to set the boat afloat in case she got aground. When the Eclipse and the A.L. Shotwell ran their great race many years ago, it was said that pains were taken to scrape the gilding off the fanciful device which hung between the Eclipse's chimneys, and that for that one trip the captain left off his kid gloves and had his head shaved. But I always doubted these things. If the boat was known to make her best speed when drawing 5.5 feet forward and 5 feet aft, she was carefully loaded to that exact figure. She wouldn't enter a dose of homeopathic pills on her manifest after that. Hardly any passengers were taken, because they not only add weight but they never will trim boat. They always run to the side when there is anything to see, whereas a conscientious and experienced steamboatman would stick to the center of the boat and part his hair in the middle with a spirit level. No way freights and no way passengers were allowed, for the racers would stop only at the largest towns, and then it would be only touch and go. Coal flats and wood flats were contracted for beforehand, and these were kept ready to hitch on to the flying steamers at a moment's warning. Double crews were carried so that all work could be quickly done. The chosen date being come, and all things in readiness, the two great steamers back into the stream and lie there jockeying a moment, and apparently watching each other's slightest movement like sentient creatures. Flags drooping, the pent steam shrieking through safety valves, the black smoke rolling and tumbling from the chimneys and darkening all the air. People everywhere. The shores, the housetops, the steamboats, the ships are packed with them, and you know that the borders of the broad Mississippi are going to be fringed with humanity, thence northward 1,200 miles, to welcome these racers. Presently tall columns of steam burst from the skate pipes of both steamers, 2 guns boom a goodbye, 2 red-shirted heroes mounted on capstans wave their small flags above the massed crews on the forecastles, 2 plaintive solos linger on the air a few waiting seconds, 2 mighty choruses burst forth, and here they come. Brass bands bray Hail Columbia, huzzah after huzzah thunders from the shores, and the stately creatures go whistling by like the wind. 133k. Those boats will never halt a moment between New Orleans and St. Louis, except for a second or two at large towns, or to hitch 30-cord wood boats alongside. You should be on board when they take a couple of those wood boats in tow and turn a swarm of men into each. By the time you have wiped your glasses and put them on, you will be wondering what has become of that wood. 2 nicely matched steamers will stay in sight of each other day after day. They might even stay side by side, but for the fact that pilots are not all alike, and the smartest pilots will win the race. If one of the boats has a lightning pilot, whose partner is a trifle his inferior, you can tell which one is on watch by noting whether that boat has gained ground or lost some during each 4-hour stretch. The shrewdest pilot can delay a boat if he has not a fine genius for steering. Steering is a very high art. One must not keep a rudder dragging across a boat's stem if he wants to get up the river fast. There is a great difference in boats, of course. For a long time I was on a boat that was so slow we used to forget what year it was we left port in, but of course this was at rare intervals. Ferryboats used to lose valuable trips because their passengers grew old and died, waiting for us to get by. This was at still rarer intervals. I had the documents for these occurrences, but through carelessness they have been mislaid. This boat, the John J. Roe, was so slow that when she finally sunk in Madrid Bend, it was 5 years before the owners heard of it. That was always a confusing fact to me, but it is according to the record anyway. She was dismally slow. Still, we often had pretty exciting times racing with islands and rafts and such things. One trip, however, we did rather well. We went to St. Louis in 16 days, but even at this rattling gait, I think we changed watches 3 times in Fort Adams Reach, which is 5 miles long. A reach is a piece of straight river, and of course the current drives through such a place in a pretty lively way. That trip we went to Grand Gulf from New Orleans in 4 days 340 miles. The Eclipse and Shotwell did it in 1. We were 9 days out in the shoot of 63 700 miles. The Eclipse and Shotwell went there in 2 days. Something over a generation ago, a boat called the J.M. White went from New Orleans to Cairo in 3 days, 6 hours and 44 minutes. In 1853 the Eclipse made the same trip in 3 days, 3 hours and 20 minutes. In 1870 the R.E. Lee did it in 3 days and 1 hour. This last is called the fastest trip on record. I will try to show that it was not. For this reason, the distance between New Orleans and Cairo when the J.M. White ran it was about 1,106 miles. Consequently, her average speed was a trifle over 14 miles per hour. In the Eclipse's day, the distance between the two ports had become reduced to 1,080 miles. Consequently, her average speed was a shade under 14 3/8 miles per hour. In the R.E. Lee's time, the distance had diminished to about 1,030 miles. Consequently, her average was about 14 1/8 miles per hour. Therefore, the Eclipse's was conspicuously the fastest time that has ever been made. Chapter 17. Cut-offs and Stephen. These dry details are of importance in one particular. They give me an opportunity of introducing one of the Mississippi's oddest peculiarities, that of shortening its length from time to time. If you will throw a long, pliant apple paring over your shoulder, it will pretty fairly shape itself into an average section of the Mississippi River. That is, the 900 or 1,000 miles stretching from Cairo, Illinois, southward to New Orleans, the same being wonderfully crooked, with a brief straight bit here and there at wide intervals. The 200-mile stretch from Cairo northward to St. Louis is by no means so crooked, that being a rocky country which the river cannot cut much. The water cuts the alluvial banks of the lower river into deep horseshoe curves, so deep indeed that in some places if you were to get ashore at one extremity of the horseshoe and walk across the neck, half or 3/4 of a mile, you could sit down and rest a couple of hours while your steamer was coming around the long elbow, at a speed of 10 miles an hour, to take you aboard again. When the river is rising fast, some scoundrel whose plantation is back in the country and therefore of inferior value has only to watch his chance, cut a little gutter across the narrow neck of land some dark night, and turn the water into it, and in a wonderfully short time a miracle has happened. To wit, the whole Mississippi has taken possession of that little ditch, and placed the countryman's plantation on its bank, quadrupling its value, and that other party's formerly valuable plantation finds itself away out yonder on a big island. The old watercourse around it will soon shoal up, boats cannot approach within 10 miles of it, and down goes its value to 1/4 of its former worth. Watches are kept on those narrow necks at needful times, and if a man happens to be caught cutting a ditch across them, the chances are all against his ever having another opportunity to cut a ditch. Pray observe some of the effects of this ditching business. Once there was a neck opposite Port Hudson, Louisiana, which was only half a mile across, in its narrowest place. You could walk across there in 15 minutes, but if you made the journey around the Cape on a raft, you traveled 35 miles to accomplish the same thing. In 1722 the river darted through that neck, deserted its old bed, and thus shortened itself 35 miles. In the same way it shortened itself 25 miles at Black Hawk Point in 1699. Below Red River Landing, Rackersai Cut-off was made, 40 or 50 years ago I think. This shortened the river 28 miles. In our day, if you travel by river from the southernmost of these 3 cut-offs to the northernmost, you go only 70 miles. To do the same thing 176 years ago, one had to go 158 miles, shortening of 88 miles in that trifling distance. At some forgotten time in the past, cut-offs were made above Vidalia, Louisiana, at Islin, and at Hales Point. These shortened the river in the aggregate 77 miles. Since my own day on the Mississippi, cut-offs have been made at Hurricane Island, at Islin, at Napoleon, Arkansas, at Walnut Bend, and at Council Bend. These shortened the river in the aggregate 67 miles. In my own time a cut-off was made at American Bend, which shortened the river 10 miles or more. Therefore, the Mississippi between Cairo and New Orleans was 1,215 miles long 176 years ago. It was 1,180 after the cut-off of 1722. It was 1,040 after the American Bend cut-off. It has lost 67 miles since. Consequently, its length is only 973 miles at present. Now, if I wanted to be one of those ponderous scientific people, and let on to prove what had occurred in the remote past by what had occurred in a given time in the recent past, or what will occur in the far future by what has occurred in late years. What an opportunity is here. Geology never had such a chance, nor such exact data to argue from, nor development of species, either. Glacial epochs are great things, but they are vague. Please observe. In the space of 176 years, the lower Mississippi has shortened itself 242 miles. That is an average of a trifle over 1 mile and a third per year. Therefore, any calm person, who is not blind or idiotic, can see that in the old Oolitic Silurian period, just 1,000,000 years ago next November, the lower Mississippi River was upwards of 1,300,000 miles long and stuck out over the Gulf of Mexico like a fishing rod. And by the same token, any person can see that 742 years from now, the lower Mississippi will be only 1.75 miles long, and Cairo and New Orleans will have joined their streets together and be plodding comfortably along under a single mayor and a mutual board of aldermen. There is something fascinating about science. One gets such wholesale returns of conjecture out of such a trifling investment of fact. When the water begins to flow through one of those ditches I have been speaking of, it is time for the people thereabouts to move. The water cleaves the banks away like a knife. By the time the ditch has become 12 or 15 feet wide, the calamity is as good as accomplished, for no power on earth can stop it now. When the width has reached 100 yards, the banks begin to peel off in slices half an acre wide. The current flowing around the bend travelled formerly only 5 miles an hour. Now it is tremendously increased by the shortening of the distance. I was on board the first boat that tried to go through the cutoff at American Bend, but we did not get through. It was toward midnight, and a wild night it was, thunder, lightning, and torrents of rain. It was estimated that the current in the cutoff was making about 15 or 20 miles an hour. 12 or 13 was the best our boat could do, even in tolerably slack water, therefore perhaps we were foolish to try the cutoff. However, Mr. Brown was ambitious and he kept on trying. The eddy running up the bank under the point was about as swift as the current out in the middle, so we would go flying up the shore like a lightning express train, get on a big head of steam, and stand by for a surge when we struck the current that was whirling by the point. But all our preparations were useless. The instant the current hit us it spun us around like a top, the water deluged the forecastle, and the boat careened so far over that one could hardly keep his feet. The next instant we were away down the river, clawing with might and main to keep out of the woods. We tried the experiment 4 times. I stood on the forecastle companionway to see. It was astonishing to observe how suddenly the boat would spin around and turn, tail the moment she emerged from the eddy, and the current struck her nose. The sounding concussion and the quivering would have been about the same if she had come full speed against a sandbank. Under the lightning flashes one could see the plantation cabins and the goodly acres tumble into the river, and the crash they made was not a bad effort at thunder. Once, when we spun around, we only missed a house about 20 feet, that had a light burning in the window, and in the same instant that house went overboard. Nobody could stay on our forecastle. The water swept across it in a torrent every time we plunged athwart the current. At the end of our 4th effort we brought up in the woods 2 miles below the cutoff. All the country there was overflowed, of course. A day or 2 later the cutoff was 3/4 of a mile wide, and boats passed up through it without much difficulty, and so saved 10 miles. The old Rackersai cutoff reduced the river's length 28 miles. There used to be a tradition connected with it. It was said that a boat came along there in the night and went around the enormous elbow the usual way, the pilots not knowing that the cutoff had been made. It was a grisly, hideous night, and all shapes were vague and distorted. The old bend had already begun to fill up, and the boat got to running away from mysterious reefs, and occasionally hitting one. The perplexed pilots fell to swearing, and finally uttered the entirely unnecessary wish that they might never get out of that place. As always happens in such cases, that particular prayer was answered, and the others neglected. So to this day that phantom steamer is still butting around in that deserted river, trying to find her way out. More than one grave watchman has sworn to me that on drizzly, dismal nights, he has glanced fearfully down that forgotten river as he passed the head of the island, and seen the faint glow of the spectre steamer's lights drifting through the distant gloom, and heard the muffled cough of her skate pipes and the plaintive cry of her leadsmen. In the absence of further statistics, I beg to close this chapter with one more reminiscence of Stephen. Most of the captains and pilots held Stephen's note for borrowed sums, ranging from $250 upward. Stephen never paid one of these notes, but he was very prompt and very zealous about renewing them every 12 months. Of course there came a time at last when Stephen could no longer borrow of his ancient creditors, so he was obliged to lie in wait for new men who did not know him. Such a victim was good-hearted, simple-natured young Yates. I use a fictitious name, but the real name began, as this one does, with a Y. Young Yates graduated as a pilot, got a berth, and when the month was ended and he stepped up to the clerk's office and received his $250 in crisp new bills, Stephen was there. His silvery tongue began to wag, and in a very little while Yates' $250 had changed hands. The fact was soon known at pilot headquarters, and the amusement and satisfaction of the old creditors were large and generous. But innocent Yates never suspected that Stephen's promise to pay promptly at the end of the week was a worthless one. Yates called for his money at the stipulated time. Stephen sweetened him up and put him off a week. He called then, according to agreement, and came away sugar-coated again, but suffering under another postponement. So the thing went on. Yates haunted Stephen week after week to no purpose and at last gave it up. And then straightway Stephen began to haunt Yates. Wherever Yates appeared, there was the inevitable Stephen, and not only there, but beaming with affection and gushing with apologies for not being able to pay. By and by, whenever poor Yates saw him coming, he would turn and fly and drag his company with him if he had company. But it was of no use. His debtor would run him down and corner him. Panting and red-faced, Stephen would come with outstretched hands and eager eyes, invade the conversation, shake both of Yates' arms loose in their sockets and begin. "My, what a race I've had. I saw you didn't see me and so I clapped on all steam for fear I'd miss you entirely. And here you are. There, just stand so and let me look at you, just the same old noble countenance." To Yates' friend, "Just look at him, ain't it just good to look at him? Ain't it now, ain't he just a picture? Some call him a picture, I call him a panorama, that's what he is, an entire panorama. And now I'm reminded, how I do wish I could have seen you an hour earlier. For 24 hours I've been saving up that $250 for you, been looking for you everywhere. I waited at the Planters from 6 yesterday evening till 2 o'clock this morning without rest or food. My wife says, 'Where have you been all night?' I said, 'This debt lies heavy on my mind.' She says, 'In all my days I never saw a man take a debt to heart the way you do.' I said, 'It's my nature, how can I change it?' She says, 'Well, do go to bed and get some rest.' I said, 'Not till that poor, noble young man has got his money.' So I sat up all night, and this morning out I shot, and the first man I struck told me you had shipped on the Grand Turk and gone to New Orleans. Well, sir, I had to lean up against a building and cry. So help me goodness, I couldn't help it. The man that owned the place come out cleaning up with a rag, and said he didn't like to have people cry against his building. And then it seemed to me that the whole world had turned against me, and it wasn't any use to live any more. And coming along an hour ago, suffering no man knows what agony, I met Jim Wilson and paid him the $250 on account, and to think that here you are now and I haven't got a cent. But as sure as I am standing here on this ground on this particular brick, there, I've scratched a mark on the brick to remember it by, I'll borrow that money and pay it over to you at 12 o'clock sharp tomorrow. Now stand so, let me look at you just once more." And so on. Yates' life became a burden to him. He could not escape his debtor and his debtor's awful sufferings on account of not being able to pay. He dreaded to show himself in the street, lest he should find Stephen lying in wait for him at the corner. Bogart's billiard saloon was a great resort for pilots in those days. They met there about as much to exchange river news as to play. One morning Yates was there. Stephen was there too, but kept out of sight. But by and by, when about all the pilots had arrived who were in town, Stephen suddenly appeared in the midst and rushed for Yates as for a long-lost brother.